Which step is the most impactful on the final flavor and why?
Realistically, the real answer is that the most important step in making whiskey is each and every step. There's a lot of distillers out there that would tell you that your grain selection or the quality of your grain is the most important part, and they're certainly correct. I believe the fermentation is the most important part of making your whiskey, because that's when you actually make the alcohol, and I believe I'm correct. There are other people that are going to tell you that the barrels are the most important part of making whiskey and how long it's in the barrels, and all of those people are going to be absolutely correct as well. Everything we do at the distillery, ranging from grain selection to the mashing to the fermentation to the yeast, how it's fermented, where it's fermented, how it's distilled, when it's distilled, all of these things have dramatic effects on the flavor.
To say that one is more or less important than the other is really, you're never going to win that argument ever. But if you boil it all the way down to the basics, your grain. It starts with your grain. If you've got musty corn, you're gonna have musty whiskey. It will carry through all the way, and you can church it up and call it some romantic name. It's must. Defects have a way of just hanging on. So if you are at the foundations of it, not using quality grain, everything further was sort of just out of novelty.
Depending on what it is you're looking to do as a distiller, the age of bottle of whiskey, the type of cask, it's very hard to say that one is more important than the other, because how you shape a whiskey, you'll use one of those influences more than the other. For example, we might choose to bottle a 25-year-old bourbon matured Bruichladdich, and the influence there is less on the distillation and the spirit, because the cask will have been maturing and influencing that whiskey for 25 years. Equally, if that was a bourbon cask or a sherry cask, there'll be a difference in the type of wood that will give you those flavours. We're thinking about younger whiskey, we're thinking about barley we've used, for example, bare barley, bottled at a young age so that we can really showcase the flavours of the grain coming through. There are so many different ways where you're going to be able to shape the flavour, and depending on what it is you want to do, or depending on the product that it is you're bottling, you're going to come up with something different. So for us at the moment with Bruichladdich, really looking at barley varieties, looking at farming methods, whether it's organic or biodynamic, whether you're thinking about the terroir in the grain and how that translates through into flavour in the whiskey. Many times I've heard over the years 75% of the flavour in a whiskey comes from the cask. My response to that is that I think about 37% of statistics are made up on the spot. You just have to kind of take each whiskey as it comes. These are not uniform products, they are individual, and they all have something unique about them, and as a distiller I'm able to kind of highlight different aspects depending on the whiskey we want to produce.
I would say it varies dramatically by the particular whiskey, and it depends which aspect the distiller has chosen to emphasize. In a younger whiskey, mashing or fermentation might be much more impactful. In a rye, the mash and the inclusion of a high rye is probably pretty flavor impactful. In a bourbon, I would say classically, ultimately, it's maturation. If I had to pick one, I would say truly the most impactful is probably maturation, because that's where you really have a choice and you can substantively shift the ultimate flavors. There's always a fair amount of variability that happens during the maturation process, and a skilled blender can use that to create all different flavors of spirit, even if the distillate was perfectly consistent going in.
It's definitely the casks. Absolutely the casks. We use principally ex-sherry casks. We have them manufactured for us. We specify what woods to be used, we specify the toasting treatment for these casks, we specify the wine that's to go in them, and for what length of time as well. And that's to try and give us the character we're looking for. That was one of the things I was showing in the first day in the sample room back in 1998, where two samples of whiskey were put out in front of me. One really dark, one quite golden yellow colour. What's the difference between these two? And what they explained to me was they're both sherry casks. One was American oak, one was European oak. It was the same whiskey, same age, the same wine seasoned for the same length of time. The only difference was where the tree grew, and they gave two completely different characters of whiskey. Casks have given you the most flavour for your whiskey, and they are hugely critical.
I think the thing that has the most impact on flavour in whiskey is intent. The intent of the maker. It's not so much, you can talk about casks, we can talk about barley, whether it's peated or not, you can talk about yeasts. It's intent. It is what is the maker trying to create, and therefore what decisions is that maker making throughout the process. That's the most important impact on flavor, ultimately.